Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar today on effective electronic patient record implementations. Today we'll be talking about testing for excellence. My name is Fran Cousins, and I'm a partner in healthcare technology with Deloitte based in London. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today to the next in our series of electronic patient record implementation webinars. The purpose of our sessions is to focus really on what constitutes an effective partnership, those partnerships necessary to succeed in EPR implementations. We highlight the common pitfalls experienced by ourselves as practitioners and also by our clients. And we provide strategies that enable you to support the delivery of your organisation's electronic patient record to achieve that really important aim of healthcare practice transformation for patients and for caregivers. Today we are on our fourth session of 7 and focusing on testing for excellence. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our team from the US. And I'll ask my colleague Mark to introduce them.
Thank you very much, Fran. It's great to co-host again with you in this series. Today, we're very fortunate to be bringing together 3 of the great experts we have out of our United States practice and globally. First of all, Rohit Perera, who serves as our global quality engineering practice leader. Rohit has spent over 20 years transformational technology and quality engineering programs for some of Deloitte's largest clients. He's bringing industry and next generation technology knowledge and depth about core system transformation and modernization, and most importantly, some innovative quality engineering delivery models today. Some of the clients Rohit has served are Kaiser Permanente, Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, and Sutter Health. Secondly is Greg Appel, who's a senior leader in Deloitte's digital care practice and has been in healthcare information technology for well over 25 years. He's served clients in the US, Canada, United Kingdom, and Dubai. He's implemented and architected EPRs as well as other key systems leveraging testing centers of excellence for their success. Some of his key clients are Fairview Health System out of Minneapolis, Northwell, Mayo, and Ascension Health. Ali Rolf is a specialty leader who has over 19 years of quality engineering and healthcare experience. He serves as a specialist leader within our practice. He works with designing and testing centers of excellence, creating testing strategies and plans for health care implementations and operations, and has led many very significant programs in the healthcare industry, such as Kaiser Permanente, Sutter, Mayo Clinic, and many Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, as well as out of industry organizations such as General Dynamics. So I think today you're going to glean a lot of great knowledge from my colleagues, and we look forward to your questions at the end. Fran?
Thank you, Mark. So if we move to the next slide, we see what's on our agenda for today. So we're going to cover a number of areas. We're going to look at why we test, the scope of testing, how you plan testing and execution, and what the common pitfalls and best practices are. And before we start, I'd just like to reflect that testing is one of the most important parts of your electronic patient record implementation. Very important to ensure that the systems we implement, the integrations that we connect, work for patients, and that our systems are safe and secure. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Greg, to talk about why we test. But before I do that, I will just talk about the governance. So you'll remember, if you've joined any of the other webinars before today, that we have this governance slide presented on each one. And the reason we do that is because it's really important to ensure that all the aspects of your program are well governed. I'd like to talk specifically about how testing fits into this governance structure. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide what the key success factors are. The Executive Steering Committee is responsible for agreeing the overall testing strategy, making sure that's fully understood, and the leadership is committed to treating testing as a discipline that's really important to achieving that outcome of safety that I mentioned earlier. The project leadership team will agree the testing exit and entry criteria, and we'll come on to that later and give you some examples of those criteria. The Programme Management Office and colleagues in the project leadership We'll also steer through the process of testing, and there are a number of different stages of testing. And again, what we'd like to do today is to take you through those testing stages, provide clear definitions, and help you understand what happens at each stage. But it's really important that the leadership are vocal advocates for testing, ensure that testing is core to the programme and is well resourced. The guiding principles of testing really focus around test as much and as early as you sensibly can. Involve the testing team in every part of the programme lifecycle. And doing this will enable you to achieve higher quality testing outcomes. Making sure there's a really clear set of processes and procedures supported by testing tools that enable you to track deficiencies and ensure that you're really drilling down to guarantee that those deficiencies have been addressed prior to system go live. And remembering crucially that testing is not just for implementation, it's for the whole life cycle of your product and its integrations. So really, the testing team is part of your electronic patient record family forever. So I'd now like to pass on to my colleague, Greg, to talk about why we test.
Thanks, Fran. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. As you embark on your EPR implementation journey, there are many aspects that you will need to understand and plan for along the way. Perhaps the area that is one of the most critical to get right, yet is underappreciated, is testing. Oftentimes, testing is seen as something that occurs toward the end of the implementation process to validate build and workflows. While this is partially correct, the enterprise nature of an EPR requires thoughtful planning and design upfront to make sure the testing program is all-encompassing and contemplates all areas of the EPR as an integrated ecosystem will touch. EPRs start as an out-of-the-box or model solution that are customized for your specific organization to your specific needs, and testing is critical to validate functionality and workflows are working as expected. Performing effective testing will reduce compliance risk, overall implementation cost, and impact to patients and staff from a potentially buggy system, thereby increasing overall satisfaction with your newly implemented EPR, which is ultimately everybody's goal. Next slide, please. The testing objectives must be established in alignment with your organization's expectations for the EPR, your clinical workflows, compliance, and integration to make sure that you're embedding this critical need into your testing program. Your EPR vendor should be aware of the testing requirements to make sure that their system is working as they designed it, but they will leave the broader testing needs and integrated areas for you to decide. It is critical that time is spent understanding the impact of the EPR to your organization and how you will test it thoroughly to mitigate your risk. Some of these key areas are operations consistency to ensure that patient safety, regulatory, and quality are tested, income integrity is validated, and that all applications are implemented and built in alignment with operational workflows, integrations, and device requirements. Next slide, please. As mentioned by Fran earlier, effective governance is critical to delivering your EPR, and this flows through to the testing program as well to clearly communicate issues, risks, and status to align stakeholders and leadership along the way. Governance will align key success factors and guiding principles to establish a program that has the rigor, reporting, and oversight required to deliver an effective testing program. Without an effective governance program to deliver testing as a discipline that is integrated with your overall EPR project, effective decision-making will be hampered and cause EPR program delays and cost overruns. Effective governance is not just the responsibility of your stakeholders and PMO, but starts at the testing team level, flowing through testing program management, the project leadership team, steering committees, and ultimately the executive team for effective and guided decision-making. It should be noted that testing teams comprise both project teams and operations, made up of clinical, financial, back office, and other key areas to make sure that your overall testing program is maintained and kept on track. Next slide, please. Following along with your testing objectives, a clear and documented understanding of how each of your vendor partners will integrate with the EPR program, inclusive of testing. The EPR vendor will have a team involved along with your build teams. Stakeholders, clinical, financial, and operational are key components of your stakeholder community. Third-party application vendors, and also quality assurance or testing. Each have very important roles to the success of your EPR, and their effective integration ultimately be tested, retested, and confirmed by the testing team. Some EPR vendors will set expectations that your build analysts can perform testing. However, our experience has been that this should be limited only to unit testing where they have direct impact. Having build analysts test other aspects of your testing program where they are not directly involved is not the best use of this level of resource and should be handled by testing resources at a level that is aligned to the testing requirements to control costs, timelines, and overall understanding of the overall workflows, integrations of the system. I am now going to hand over to Ali, who is going to walk you through how to implement an effective EPR for your organization and program. I worked with Ali for many years, and I know you are all in very safe hands. Ali?
Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate it. Good morning and good evening to everybody on the call, depending on where you are. So Greg talked about why we need to test. So I'll delve deep into how do we actually go about testing. And one of the first steps in doing that is deciding the scope for testing. So as you look across your organization, the scope is really dependent on several factors, and I'll cover just a couple here. So to begin with, the first factor would be the facilities and locations that you might have. So that includes your clinics, your hospitals, ambulatory centers, surgery centers, laboratories, etc. So really where service is provided. The processes and procedures and activities at each of these facilities and locations differ in terms of how the service is provided. So that should be reflected in the type of scope that you determine needs to be addressed. The second factor, as you can see on the slide in the middle, is the types of systems and applications, the technologies that you're implemented as part of the end state EPR. For example, your core EPR application, right? Your third-party application and workflows within those applications, and how they're connected to each other through interfaces, could be APIs, whether your clinical and revenue data will be converted over from an existing system. So converted data becomes a key aspect of something that would need to be validated. And I mentioned APIs. If you decide to pull data via APIs, that's an important consideration to make sure that you're testing the APIs appropriately. Data could be pushed or pulled from those APIs. And certainly you will have other enterprise system dependencies that you would need to consider for determining the scope of testing. An example of another enterprise system that you might think of is a data warehouse system, for example, where you might aggregate clinical data, revenue data, and report out from there for clinical reporting as well as financial performance. All these factors come together to help you determine the scope of your testing. And we recommend different types of testing to achieve objectives that Greg talked about earlier, a couple of slides earlier. And making sure that the testing is thorough through all of these different types of testing or phases, as you see on the right-hand side. And on the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these testing phases. Okay. So earlier, as Greg described the vision and the objectives of testing, We're going to tie those back to the different test phases and why we recommend implementing these test phases. Each of the recommended test phases are aimed at meeting the objectives of technically validating the application, making sure that operations function appropriately, or the revenue integrity. Those were the three main objectives that we described earlier. As the EPR system is being developed or configured based on the design decisions that are made jointly with the EPR vendor, or through decisions made internally in the organization, the different test phases become applicable. So, for example, when somebody is actually configuring the system or building specifically within a particular application, some functionality, they conduct unit testing. That is the first type of testing that will occur for your EPR. And the person configuring or building will be responsible for doing that. Now, post that is when we jump into these different test phases. For example, for application testing. Once this unit testing has been done, application testing is the first phase of testing that allows one to start small within a module or application, and we recommend starting there. Depending on whatever terminology your EPR vendor might use, they might call the different parts of their EPR application either application or module. But regardless, as an example, so you might have a patient registration application or module, and you may test entering patient demographics there and where the financial responsibility for services provided resides. Another example of a workflow contained within an application or module is you may want to schedule a doctor's appointment for a patient, or let's say you want to schedule an inpatient stay at a hospital for a patient. So all of those things are contained within particular modules of an application that you might want to test in application testing. At the end of the day, what you're validating is within that limited application or module, you're testing the workflow of what a patient might experience and what a provider may actually do for that experience. Going next to interface testing, as the slide states here, is the validation and confirmation that systems connect appropriately. So the mechanisms for connection, whether they are direct interfaces or they go through an interface engine, just making sure the connections are made and they're working appropriately, they're able to exchange data per the design requirements. Then after application testing and interface testing has been done, we're ready to move on to something broader, which we call integrated testing. And this now goes beyond individual applications, goes across interfaces and is aimed at testing a patient's journey through the entire system. For example, the journey of a patient that comes in to the emergency room is feeling some chest pains. So they're brought into the emergency room, maybe admitted to the emergency room for observation for some time. It could be that after monitoring and a little bit of treatment, they're admitted to the hospital because they need to stay for a longer period of time. So it becomes an inpatient admission. So their journey moved from coming into the emergency room to now becoming an inpatient stay. And later on, it may be decided that they need surgery. So then this patient moves on to surgery, and they might actually stay in the hospital after that. Now that the clinical episode is over after that patient is discharged after receiving service, then the revenue portion of the EPR starts, where you might determine financial responsibility for the payments that need to be made. So in short, what I'm describing here is a full journey for a patient in your EPR system, and that's what we would test in integration testing. I'll touch a little bit on regression testing, which is a key test phase. Typically, it's done after an EPR implementation is complete. However, it's also good to conduct this kind of testing in a couple of scenarios. So let's say your EPR is being implemented and there are upgrades happening at the same time. So the vendor is releasing product updates. You may choose to incorporate those during your implementation, or you may choose to do it after. If you do incorporate during the implementation, it's a good idea to conduct regression testing, which could be a subset of your application testing, as well as your integration testing scenarios. The other situation would be that for whatever reason, during the implementation, as you're testing, there's a lot of build that's still being done. And we see that typically happening because design decisions are changed. So you may also want to do regression testing at that point to make sure that already built functionality is not broken. So very important to consider those aspects when deciding on regression testing. I'll say a little bit about content and volume testing. That's really aimed at testing things like devices, reports, security. And really, as an example, let me say that, let's say you have lab tests. Physicians must be able to order lab tests or order medications. So you want to make sure that all the permutations and combinations of those are available to the physician as they're using physician order entry in the EPR. Not only that, but I'll give you another example. So for mapped record testing, not only within the EPR, you want to make sure your labs are available to the physician so they can place the order, but you also want to make sure that the downstream systems have those mapped appropriately so that when the information flows to the lab system, let's say it's a third-party lab system, it registers appropriately and doesn't error out. And then lab technicians are able to act on that and send the lab results back to the EPR as appropriate. Okay. And then last but not least, making sure that pre-go live, we're letting users actually experience the system. It may be that some users are involved earlier than this phase, but it's important to get most of the bugs resolved in the previous test phases before we expose users to the system, at least at large. So what we want to validate at that point is that the system meets their needs, both in terms of functionality and from a performance perspective. Fran, let me pause there, see if you have anything additionally that you want to say about the UK system there.
Of course. Thanks, Ali. So one of the strategies that our government is employing in terms of the delivery of healthcare is to bring organisations together. And in order to provide care pathways across those organisations, data systems and electronic patient record systems need to be integrated. So you saw Ali on the previous slide describe the types of locations that would be determining the scope of your testing. So it's important in that context for us to think about how we might test a patient journey across a whole system. And some of the integrated care systems that are now establishing integrated care records are doing just that. So testing is something that will be with us as we move forward to achieve our aims of integrated care in the UK. I'll hand back to you now, Ali. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran. All right, so let's delve a little bit deeper into the testing approach. The very first thing that's really important is to define and follow a testing methodology for your EPR implementation. The objective really here is make sure everybody's on the same page. They're in alignment on how testing will be performed, right? So at the top of the slide in the graphic, you see a typical testing life cycle, right, that you might follow. So we begin with requirements. Then we move into the test planning phase. Key component after that would be to develop test cases. Then how do we actually execute the testing, right? And then once we're into test execution, any failures that are encountered, how do we actually resolve that and move into test reporting? The reporting continues through all different types, different phases of the testing life cycle, so that stakeholders are aware where we stand within the testing life cycle. And on the bottom graphic, you see that I've provided a little bit more detail. Some of the things that I've selected here to talk about are starting at the beginning. What we want to do is establish an overall testing timeline. Now, it's important that this testing timeline obviously align with the EPR implementation timeline. It may sound obvious, but we've seen many organizations struggle in terms of where testing might fit within the overall EPR implementation and how testing will be conducted, and allowing enough time so that testing can be conducted appropriately. It's not an area where you want to cut corners. In addition to establishing a testing timeline that is actually feasible and fits in with the overall implementation, we would definitely recommend selecting and then actually setting up the right tools for two main purposes: for test management as a whole, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next few slides, and then also test automation. We feel like test automation is something that most vendors nor do our clients think of from the very start, and we recommend automating test execution as much as possible for larger coverage, and also to make sure that we're able to test in an efficient manner. At the end of the day, test cases are really the key component of what you test. And these have to be developed specifically for the different test types or phases that we talked about in the previous slide. And they should be based on clinical workflows and operational workflows. Obviously, also revenue cycle is important as well. But from a patient safety perspective, making sure that all of the clinical workflows are accurately represented. The other piece is making sure that test environments are established appropriately. So we don't just need separate test environments and standalone test environments. We actually need test environments that mimic end-state production functionality. We don't need them to be exactly as production sizing and scale is, but definitely we want functionality with the interfaces connected so that we can meaningfully test the workflows that we talked about on the previous slide and different test phases. In terms of test data, we recommend using manufactured data most of the time. And for specific testing types, for example, you might choose to bring in converted data. And for validation of that, you would want actual production data in your system. Generally, though, from a security point of view, and to avoid any data breaches, we recommend that test environments only contain manufactured test data. And then this data also should be realistic, based on what you actually see in your patient population, right? Testing scenarios that are not realistic and don't represent the right data, that's not as helpful to do. Okay. And then I'll quickly touch on the last two aspects. In the interest of time, we'll keep moving. Test execution reporting is really important. I mentioned that all different stakeholders on the program should be able to see reports and tell where we are with testing. And there's also an aspect of transparency here to make sure everybody understands what the testing results are. And several decisions, for example, test sign-off decisions will be based on these testing reports. In terms of test sign-off, it is critical that the testing team reviews the reports with business and operational stakeholders, and business and operational stakeholders ultimately, at the end of the day, sign off on the testing results. Okay. So I'll pick a few things from the previous slide. So test execution is something we want to talk about here. It's very important to make sure that the testing methodology defines how testing will proceed. Before we actually start any test phase, what we want to make sure is that entry criteria for that phase are evaluated. So for example, if we are talking about application testing, what we want to make sure is all of the configuration for the application, ideally, is completed. We see many times that this particular entry criteria for that test phase is not evaluated. That results in having to repeat application testing, and that wastes a lot of time because there's a huge amount of effort that goes into executing testing. What we also want to make sure before we start test execution is that our test cases are developed according to the workflows and decisions that have been made on the program, and they're located in a central place. So we'll talk about testing tools. We recommend putting them there, but they're available in a central place and are the source of truth going forward. Often it happens that there are various versions of those, and that causes confusion for not only for those who are executing those test cases, but also other stakeholders on the program. And then when a test phase is completed, making sure that the test exit criteria for that phase, or for that matter, within, let's say for application testing, you're running 4 cycles of testing, making sure that each particular cycle exit criteria are reviewed. Let's say you decide that 100% of your application test cases need to be executed in that first application cycle, then you want to review, did we actually complete those, right? In later cycles, it might be, you might say we need to be at 90% pass rate for a particular test cycle. So reviewing that with the different stakeholders and saying, have you met that criteria or not? If you don't meet the criteria, then a discussion should happen with the business stakeholders to decide whether you move forward or re-execute. In general, though, the test cycle looks like executing, and let's say there's a fail, identifying and fixing the issues, executing a first pass, and if you so decide that your exit criteria is that you're going to require 2 consecutive passes, clean passes, then doing a second execution. This particular first pass and second pass is based on a vendor criteria and vendor requirement. But that's an example of how you might set up your exit criteria for getting out of a test phase. Okay. On this slide, I want to talk a little bit about defect management or test failure management. You will undoubtedly encounter testing failures. They're part and parcel of test execution. And the detection of defects is not, it's not the end of the world. In fact, it's good. You want to identify defects at this point so that defects don't actually go into your production system. A robust process to identify these defects, triage them appropriately, have the appropriate person investigate the root cause of those failures, and then actually resolve them before passing on to the testing team to conduct the retest. And this cycle will continue in all of your test phases. It's applicable to all the different test phases that we talked about. So a test execution tool I mentioned, I will talk in a little bit detail about that, is key to making sure that it provides test management. And test management, really, the key components there are your test case repository, single source of truth, providing you the ability to execute testing from that tool, providing you the ability to report from that test tool. So that's a minimum requirement for a test management tool. And it's important to select the right tool that will work for you. The reason you want to do these things within that test tool is to make sure that you have a record of who actually executed your testing, when was it executed, and what was the actual result of it. So a test management tool is important from that aspect. The other key thing we want to do in our test management tool is document our defects. Again, the same principle applies there. It should follow the process that you define, and we talked through the different stages of addressing a test failure or defect on the previous slide, but also documenting it so that you know what was the defect, who found it, who is it assigned to fix it, and when was it fixed. So you also want to keep track of the severity of those defects. So all of those things can be done in a test management tool efficiently and effectively. If you had to do that manually, that would be a huge, huge problem. The one other thing I will touch on this slide here is that test automation tools, as I recommended earlier, that we say think about test automation from the very start for test execution. The test automation tools that we've listed on the right-hand side have come a long way. They're no longer the tools that just document test execution, but they actually have now incorporated AI and ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities. For example, the COFTA tool mentioned on the right, that is now able to take normal English language and using NLP and translate into automated test cases. So a business user, for example, as long as they can type in normal English what they want the tool to do, the tool will execute just like a tester would go and execute test cases. So very powerful functionality that is now available for us to use. That's why we would recommend thinking of automation from the very start. And then last but not least, before I hand off to Rohit for talking about best practices and how to avoid common pitfalls, is making sure that test execution entry and exit criteria are documented and adhered to at every phase. Fran mentioned some of this, Greg mentioned some of this, is that making sure that before you enter into any test phase, you're very clear on what are the prerequisites for going into that particular test phase. And then coming out of it, what are the metrics we need to meet? For example, test script execution. Do we need 100% execution for the overall test phase, or do we need it for particular cycles within those test phases? How many defects are we able to tolerate going out of a test phase? So for example, addressing all of the high priority defects, addressing all of the even medium priority defects. Low defects, it may be that you decide that's okay in application testing, but not coming out of integration testing. So those are some examples of how you might apply entry and exit criteria. At this point, Rohit, let me hand off to you to talk about some common pitfalls and best practices for testing.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ollie and Greg. So to wrap up, let's talk through a short list of items that I hope will enable each of you to better plan for your EPR implementation and testing, as well as sidestep any potential issues based on our experience. We also facilitate a lesson learned session after each implementation to identify what went well and what could have been done differently. One of the things we saw on a very early engagement that I had, it was a multi-specialty hospital health system. The EPR team was stood up completely separately from the enterprise test team. And the focus of the EPR team was only on testing the EPR implementation. Post-implementation, however, there were upgrades, there were defects, there were enhancements, and all needed to be tested. And the enterprise test team wasn't as familiar with the EPR. They were behind, and they started to drink from the fire hose to try and catch up. So our first lesson learned is really the importance of setting up a robust testing function for the longer term. Also using the implementation to enhance or refine any of the current testing processes and put a clear plan in place for reuse of test cases and automation scripts post the implementation, test data and environment provisioning, and then putting together a robust regression suite that is continually updated. There's, of course, lots of planning that goes into an EPR implementation. Most of us have experienced that on testing on large engagements and large implementations, it always gets crunched. So that can actually be exacerbated by the lack of planning ahead for the time to create test cases, identify test data, prepare environments, and execute the test phases that Ali discussed previously. Additionally, one thing we've seen is establishing a risk-based approach to testing that's approved by the stakeholders is important at the start so you can better manage through any delays in the delivery to testing. So in conjunction with planning, having the right team, planning for the effort, planning for the budget makes for a much higher quality release. Leveraging a standard bottoms-up and top-down estimation model, building in contingency for defects, environment downtime, delivery delays, etc., puts less strain on both the resources as well as the leaders in the heat of an EPR implementation. So at a multi-specialty, multi-hospital health system, we joined an EPR program that was in flight because of delays. There was a lack of confidence from the sponsors on the quality of delivery. And the first thing we found was the build team was very stretched. The test team was understaffed and primarily playing a coordination role. And the builders were actually doing unit testing and doing some integrated testing and then deploying the code for users to actually validate. So there were defects that were found by the users as they were running through their workflows. There was a lack of integrated testing. But because of this, the users were very dissatisfied and they lost confidence in the EPR implementation early on. All users, as we know, are different. They adjust their workflows to meet their specific needs. And this is where having experienced testers that can find the issues earlier in the implementation really reduces both cost as well as significantly reduces dissatisfaction from stakeholders. Communication and transparency of status and metrics also goes a long way in building trust as well as alleviating concern. So effective governance of testing with a clear set of metrics and reporting to stakeholders identifies or enables the identification as well as communication of issues much earlier, as well as increases stakeholder and executive confidence in the quality of the implementation. And then finally, assuming the EPR package you select will provide test cases that cover your organization's nuances with minimal updates is a fallacy. Plan ahead for tailoring the test to your specific needs. Reuse, of course, is very important, but planning for updates to out-of-the-box test cases, validating the end-to-end flow with your unique lab, pharmacy, and other ancillary applications is critical to delivering quality and reducing patient as well as operational risks. I do hope that this was informational, and I'll hand off to Francis to facilitate any questions for the group.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rohit, and to all our speakers, Greg and Ali as well. It's been an absolutely fascinating exposition of how to test for excellence, which is superb. And I know that that last slide may be one perhaps that programme sponsors and individuals who are responsible for testing might stick to their office wall, something to keep at the front of your mind as you're going through your testing programme. So we've got some great questions coming in. So for the panel, the first question. So Ali, you mentioned that automation is something that you consider from the very beginning of the testing process. Can you give us a sense of what kind of efficiency automation might bring to a testing program?
Absolutely. So we've seen that automation can reduce the effort anywhere from 15 to 25% easily, right? Now, it really depends on how mature your organization is, how good your test cases are, but there's a significant reduction in effort that we see. And it's not just about reduction in effort, right? It's also, most organizations struggle with how much do we test? So automation will allow you to test more, but then we should do that intelligently by saying, should we really be testing everything, or what are the right things to test? So there's an 80-20 rule that we apply to say, what are the highest risk items? Or as Rohit was mentioning, just factoring that in as well. But I've seen improvements in terms of efficiency gains, 15 to 25% easily, and also reduction in defects into production to less, 50% less, or even less than that. So.
Oh, that's very impressive. There's a related question here, which Greg, perhaps you could answer, which is when you're standing at the beginning of your testing journey, how do you estimate the model, the resources that you need for your testing? If you've defined your scope, what kind of methods, and is there a blueprint that you have in mind or that you use when you're doing that?
Thanks, Fran. That's a very good question. So when we go through and we define the testing program for a given EPR, or if you extend beyond just the EPR implementation and go into the ongoing project life cycles, upgrades, and everything else, it's important to consider the workflows that you're doing. Now, for each of the given modules, depending on the number of workflows, you're going to want to have, for each of the different phases, one being design up front, you're going to need to have a designer for each of the different modules, so that you're working hand in hand with the stakeholders to understand the expectations of that module, the workflows, and the integrations that are going to be required with the rest of the EPR ecosystem. That's going to flow into the development of those test scripts and test cases and scenarios, both from a manual and an automation perspective. Depending on, as you're going through the design phase, each phase, let me back up here, each phase is going to have its own set of resources specific to the program. The designers are going to design the program looking at the automations, looking at the manual requirements. When you get in the development cycle, each of those different modules are going to have the appropriate number of automation and manual test developers. There are certainly accelerators that are out there and available within the testing tools that can enable some of that development. But it's going to be important that you consider, probably at least 1 to 2 designers for each module, and probably 2 to 4, depending on the complexities, for the individual development side from the automation and manual. When you get into execution, it gets a little bit more complicated, and that really comes down to the mix of automations to your manual processes, and your level of comfort in leveraging automation in your program. I like to see somewhere between 50 and 60% of my scripts being in the automation side, which minimizes the amount of testers I need in order to complete the testing. You're going to need to have testers that are going to be involved in your department testing, integration testing, and integrated testing is kind of the overall, how does everything all work together, as well as inside of your different workflows and device testing. Unit testing will be handled by the builders themselves. Rule of thumb, I like to see a little bit of an overlap. If you're operating in a 60% automation model where I'm running between 2 to 3 resources per module, but it can tailor depending on what you're seeing as far as the specific needs of your workflows.
Thank you very much. We've got a great question coming in here about clinical testers. So Rohit, I wonder if you could take this question. So it's about the number of clinical testers you use, and also whether it's sensible for those people to be the people who've been involved in the workflow design sessions and who will also may become super users as you move to the final phases before go live. What do you think about that?
I actually think it's always positive to include clinical testers in your testing process. They've got a wealth of experience from the work that they do day to day, and they can actually identify and come up with workflows as well as data challenges that a tester may not. However, the best practice I would follow is to make sure that a tester actually validates the workflow, make sure the workflow is actually working, and then hand off to your clinical testers to continue to extend the actual testing that they do on it to make sure that it's working and actually meets their needs as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you have reflections on whether that's sensible for that core group of clinicians to play multiple roles in the program? Have you seen that in any of your experiences? Does that feel?
I actually have. So having clinicians part of the program is critical to the program success. We've always had not just physician sponsors, but actually physician champions for different modules as well as different parts of the implementation. What also helps is they can bring their friends and their colleagues together and actually start enabling that adoption of the new EPR product. The biggest challenge is, physician adoption when a new EPR comes out. The workflows may not be exactly what they're used to. And here you have a colleague that can actually walk them through it and can talk through exactly what they're doing and what the rationale was for a particular design decision or a particular workflow change, and how it's going to be valuable to them. So I think having clinicians part of that exercise is very, very critical.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got another great question here coming in about the relationship between the testing of the applications in the way that we've discussed today, and also then the connectivity testing. So how actually people use the applications with the various devices that will be on in the clinical environment. Rohit, do you have any reflections on what best practice is there to make that transition into connectivity testing?
Yeah, so in what I've seen work really well is a stepped process, right? So the more stepped process you can put in testing, the more successful you will be. So start with your EPR module, make sure that the module is working. Start with connecting that module to ancillary applications. Start to connect those to the devices and the medical devices, and make sure that those are working. Now, each one of those could be tested in their silo, but it's important to make sure you've tested them in their silo and then bring them all together. The other piece that we've seen with the proliferation of just Internet of Things and the number of med devices that are connected and coordinating and feeding information, it's important to have a good grasp on what those devices are, but also plan ahead because technology is moving at warp speed. So plan ahead for making sure if there's a new system or a new device that you're going to be able to connect it. And how do you do that? You do that through automation. So Ali talked a lot about automation and the importance of it. Setting up that automation up front actually enables you to test a host of devices very, very quickly. And every time there's an upgrade that comes in or there's a change that happens and you have a new release, you can actually run the automation scripts. You can set up a set of regression scripts, run them quickly, and you have more confidence because you'll find those issues as early as possible. I don't know, Ali or Greg, if there's anything else you guys would add.
Yeah, from my perspective, Rohit, I think you covered most of it, but the automation piece, I will say, is key for me in making sure that the connectivity works. You don't always want to be spending that time doing manual work there. So a great case for implementing automation from the very beginning. Certainly for regression, yes, but as the program guidelines and vision is being established, making automation a big part of it helps.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Those were fantastic questions from the audience, and really appreciate you asking them today. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about testing for excellence. I've certainly found it absolutely fascinating and giving us really some great advice as we progress to walk through our EPR journey as part of this series. So what we'd like to do now is just to move on past the question and answer section of today and just to share with you some other resources that we have available that may be of interest to you as you consider your digitisation journey in your health system. And I'll ask Mark to speak to these.
Great, thank you, Fran, and thank you, colleagues, for a very informative presentation. Obviously, a very thoughtful one that we all are highly interested in. You know, in addition to the type of resources we provided you today with the testing EPR seminar, in addition to the rest of it, Deloitte invests in what we call the Deloitte Center for Health Solutions, which is really one of our research arms. So when we start thinking about health system innovation, future trends, what the future of health is going to look like, and we have a very provocative piece out there of what healthcare will look like in 2040. This is a resource for you to go to really think about what the current trends are, as well as what we think will be happening in the future, whether it be hospital, home, or other things that are going to affect your future and your care delivery models. So I would encourage you to please go to the Deloitte Center for Health Solutions and look at some of the great research we're doing. Again, it's free, and it's something that we'd love to hear your feedback on. Fran?
Thank you, Mark. And one thing that is absolutely for sure as we move towards that connected future of healthcare, testing is going to be a core part of every organisation's capability. And as Ali says, the more automation, the better for ensuring that we can deliver that integrated care for our patients. So if you've been interested today and you would like to listen to some of our previous webinars, at the bottom of the slide here, you can see the web link to the recordings of those webinars. Please do listen again, and you can do that at any time of the day or night. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 24th of June, and it will be on integration and reporting. So an important and very related topic to testing. How do we make the best of the data that we generate? And how does that inform improvements for the care of our patients? So please join us at 4 o'clock on the 24th of June. Thank you again for joining us from many countries around the world. And thank you especially to our speakers for their expert interpretation of testing for excellence. Good afternoon.